November 7, 1944. Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the dock, his eyes fixed on the photographs spread across the intelligence table before him. The images showed USS Franklin, an Essex-class carrier, damaged and listing after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. His staff officers waited in silence as Ozawa studied each photograph with the intensity of a man examining evidence of his own nation's doom. The photos revealed something that transcended tactical intelligence. They showed the internal structure of an American fleet carrier, the machinery spaces, the damage control stations, the complexity of systems that kept such a vessel operational. But it wasn't the technology that held Ozawa's attention. It was the realization of what these photographs represented at scale. Because Japanese naval intelligence had just confirmed what many in the Imperial Navy had refused to believe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. America had not built one or two of these carriers. They had built 24, and they were still building more. Ozawa set down the photographs and looked at his officers. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a man who had just calculated the exact mathematics of his nation's defeat. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we are not fighting a navy. We are fighting an industrial system that treats these ships the way we treat destroyers. The war is already over. We simply have not yet acknowledged it." The room fell silent. No one dared respond, because every officer present knew that Vice Admiral Ozawa had just spoken a truth that the Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer avoid. The evidence was irrefutable, the numbers were crushing, and the strategic implications were terminal. This is the story of how Japan's naval leadership confronted the most devastating industrial reality of the Pacific War, not through propaganda or speculation, but through captured documents, interrogated prisoners, and reconnaissance photographs that documented America's shipbuilding miracle. A miracle that transformed the balance of naval power so completely that by late 1944, Japanese admirals understood they were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting merely to delay the inevitable. The Essex-class carriers were not just ships, they were the physical manifestation of American industrial supremacy. And when Japanese naval intelligence finally compiled the complete picture of how many had been built, how quickly they had been launched, and how many more were under construction, it shattered every assumption the Imperial Navy had held about their chances of victory. 6 months earlier, in the spring of 1944, Japanese naval planning still operated under the assumption that American carrier production, while substantial, remained within comprehensible bounds. Intelligence estimates suggested the United States might complete 6 to 8 new fleet carriers by year's end. This was manageable, concerning, certainly, but not catastrophic. Japanese carriers, though fewer in number, were considered superior in crew quality and tactical doctrine. The Imperial Navy's strategy since the devastating losses at Midway in June 1942 had been fundamentally defensive. Preserve remaining carrier strength, train new pilots to replace combat losses, husband resources for the decisive battle that would break American will to continue the war. This strategy assumed that American carrier strength, while growing, would remain limited enough that Japan could achieve tactical parity in specific engagements through superior skill and concentration of forces. These assumptions were built on intelligence that was both outdated and incomplete. Japanese reconnaissance of American shipyards was limited by geography and American security measures. Neutral ship captains provided some information. Signal intelligence offered fragments of data. Prisoners occasionally revealed details during interrogation. But the complete picture remained obscured. What Japanese planners did not fully grasp was the transformation that American shipbuilding had undergone since Pearl Harbor. The Essex-class program represented not merely an expansion of existing naval construction, but a complete reinvention of how major warships could be designed, built, and delivered. The United States Navy had taken the lessons of carrier warfare from the first year of the war and created a standardized design that could be mass-produced with unprecedented speed. The Essex-class specification called for a carrier displacing 30,000 tons, measuring 872 feet in length, capable of operating more than 90 aircraft. Each ship required thousands of tons of steel, miles of wiring, complex machinery, armor plating, weapons systems, and sophisticated electronics. Traditional naval construction suggested such vessels would take 3 to 4 years to build and require specialized shipyards with unique capabilities. American industry transformed this timeline. At shipyards in Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and Quincy, workers developed assembly line techniques previously reserved for smaller vessels. Prefabricated sections were constructed in separate facilities and transported to the shipyard for final assembly. Electrical systems were pre-wired before installation. Standardization meant that components built for one carrier could be installed in any other Essex-class ship without modification. The result was a production tempo that would have seemed impossible by traditional standards. USS Essex, the class's lead ship, was laid down on April 28, 1941. She was launched on July 31, 1942, just 15 months later. She was commissioned on December 31, 1942, exactly 20 months after construction began, and this was before the system reached peak efficiency. By 1943, American shipyards were completing Essex-class carriers in 12 to 18 months from keel laying to commissioning. At peak production, a new Essex-class carrier was being launched approximately every 6 weeks. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, one must understand Japan's carrier construction capabilities by comparison. The Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier, designed with an armored flight deck and improved damage control systems, was laid down in July 1941. She was not completed until March 1944, a construction period of 32 months. She was sunk by an American submarine 3 months later in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, having barely participated in the war at all. Japan would complete only one additional fleet carrier after Midway, the Unryu, commissioned in August 1944. Her construction took 24 months. She would be sunk by a submarine in December 1944 without ever engaging American forces in combat. The disparity was not merely numerical, it was temporal. By the time Japan completed one carrier, America completed 3 or 4. And unlike Japanese construction, which strained national resources and competed with other military priorities, American carrier construction occurred alongside massive production of every other category of naval vessel: merchant ships, landing craft, destroyer escorts, battleships, cruisers, submarines. The arsenal of democracy was not a slogan, it was a description of literal capacity. Through the first half of 1944, Japanese naval intelligence gradually assembled fragments of this reality. Reconnaissance flights over American bases in the Central Pacific counted increasing numbers of fleet carriers. Radio intercepts identified new carrier names and hull numbers. Interrogation of captured American pilots yielded information about their ships, but the data remained incomplete, often contradictory, and difficult to assess with precision. Japanese intelligence officers faced institutional pressure to provide assessments that supported operational planning rather than strategic despair. Reporting that American carrier strength had grown beyond Japanese capacity to contest would have undermined the Navy's continued political influence and resource allocation. So intelligence estimates remained conservatively bounded, suggesting American strength was significant but not overwhelming. This changed in June 1944, during and after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The battle, fought on June 19th and 20th, resulted in catastrophic Japanese losses. Approximately 400 Japanese aircraft were destroyed against minimal American losses in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk, including the newest carrier, Taiho. But beyond the immediate tactical disaster, the battle provided Japanese observers with something more devastating than defeat. It provided them with accurate counts of American carrier strength in a single location. American Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, deployed 15 carriers to the battle. 7 were Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 were light carriers of the Independence class. The light carriers alone represented a category of vessel that Japan had not constructed at all, converted cruiser hulls carrying 30 to 35 aircraft each, built rapidly to supplement the Essex-class program. Japanese reconnaissance pilots and submarine observers who survived the battle reported these numbers back to Imperial headquarters. 15 carriers in one task force. The implications were staggering. If America could deploy 15 carriers to a single operational area, how many did they possess in total? How many were operating elsewhere in the Pacific? How many remained in the Atlantic or in training areas? And most critically, how many more were still under construction? The intelligence section of the combined fleet staff began compiling every available piece of information about American carrier construction. They reviewed reconnaissance photographs of American bases showing multiple carriers at anchor. They cross-referenced prisoner interrogation reports that mentioned specific ship names. They analyzed American news broadcasts and newspaper reports, which, despite wartime censorship, occasionally revealed details about ship launchings and commissioning ceremonies. By August 1944, the assessment was complete. Japanese naval intelligence concluded that the United States had operational or nearly operational at least 20 Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 Independence-class light carriers, and dozens of escort carriers used for aircraft transport, submarine hunting, and amphibious support. The total American carrier force exceeded 100 ships of various classes. Japan, by comparison, possessed fewer than 10 carriers of all types, most small, most lacking adequate aircraft or trained pilots. The numbers were so lopsided that they challenged belief. Senior officers questioned whether the intelligence was accurate. Could America truly have built so many carriers so quickly? The answer required verification through multiple sources. That verification came through examination of captured American documents and equipment. In the aftermath of battles throughout the Central Pacific, Japanese forces occasionally recovered materials from shot-down aircraft or destroyed American installations. Technical manuals, navigation charts, even pieces of correspondence sometimes fell into Japanese hands. In September 1944, Japanese intelligence obtained something more valuable than fragmentary documents. They acquired detailed structural plans of an Essex-class carrier recovered from damaged American aircraft off Formosa. The plans had been used for damage control training, showing the internal layout of the ship's compartments, machinery spaces, and critical systems. Japanese naval architects studied these plans with intense focus. What they discovered confirmed and amplified their worst fears. The Essex-class design was brilliant in its simplicity. Unlike Japanese carriers, which often featured unique layouts and customized systems, the Essex-class was ruthlessly standardized. Every ship was virtually identical. This meant training, spare parts, repair procedures, and tactical doctrine could be applied uniformly across the entire class. The design emphasized survivability through redundancy. Multiple fire mains, isolated damage control stations, and compartmentalized fuel systems meant that an Essex-class carrier could absorb tremendous punishment and remain operational. Japanese carriers, by contrast, featured centralized systems that made them vulnerable to catastrophic damage from single hits. But it was the production implications that most disturbed Japanese analysts. The standardization, the prefabrication techniques, the modular construction, all indicated that America had treated carrier construction as a mass production problem rather than an artisanal craft. They had not built warships. They had manufactured them. Commander Masataka Chihaya, a staff officer in the Combined Fleet Intelligence Section, later wrote about examining these documents. "We knew intellectually that American industry was vast," he recalled, "but seeing the actual engineering that enabled such rapid construction forced us to confront what vast actually meant." They had turned warship construction into something resembling automobile assembly, and we had no capacity to compete with that. The photographs of USS Franklin, damaged during operations in October 1944, provided additional confirmation. The ship had been hit by Japanese aircraft and suffered significant damage, yet remained afloat and under her own power. Reconnaissance photographs showed the extent of the damage, extensive fires, destroyed sections of the flight deck, but also showed American damage control teams effectively containing the destruction. What struck Japanese analysts most profoundly was what the photographs revealed about Franklin's internal structure. The ship's complexity, the redundant systems, the sophisticated damage control capabilities all suggested a level of engineering investment that Japan could not match. Building 24 such ships within 3 years represented an industrial achievement that transcended Japan's entire national capacity. Vice Admiral Ozawa, who had commanded Japanese carriers at the Philippine Sea and would later command at Leyte Gulf, studied the intelligence reports with growing alarm. Ozawa was one of Japan's most capable naval officers, a realist who understood the material factors that determined naval outcomes. He had opposed the war from the beginning, understanding that Japan's industrial base could not sustain conflict with America. Now, in autumn 1944, Ozawa faced the complete validation of his earlier fears. The numbers were undeniable: 24 Essex-class carriers completed or completing. Each carrier operated 90 aircraft. That meant over 2,000 carrier aircraft in just the Essex-class alone, not counting light carriers, escort carriers, or land-based aircraft. Japan's entire naval air arm, depleted by years of combat, numbered fewer than 1,500 operational aircraft total. The mathematical certainty of defeat was absolute. Even if every Japanese pilot performed at 3 times the effectiveness of American pilots, even if Japanese aircraft were superior in every respect, the numerical disparity would still prove insurmountable. And neither of those conditions held true. By late 1944, American pilots were better trained, American aircraft were superior in most categories, and American operational tempo exceeded anything Japan could match. Ozawa shared his assessment with Admiral Soimu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet. Toyoda, though more optimistic than Ozawa, could not dispute the intelligence. The evidence was comprehensive and consistent across multiple sources. America had built an armada that Japan could not defeat, yet acknowledgement of defeat did not translate to surrender. The Japanese military government, dominated by army officers, refused to consider capitulation. The Navy, though devastated, remained institutionally committed to fighting. Cultural factors, political realities, and fear of Allied retribution all worked against rational strategic reassessment, so Japan would continue fighting. But its naval officers, particularly those with access to intelligence about American carrier production, now understood they were not fighting to achieve victory. They were fighting to delay the inevitable, to inflict sufficient casualties that America might offer terms short of unconditional surrender. It was a strategy born of desperation, built on denial, and destined to fail. The Essex-class carriers would continue arriving in the Pacific throughout 1945. Each new carrier brought 90 aircraft, 5,000 crew members, and unstoppable industrial momentum. Against this force, Japan would throw its remaining strength in increasingly desperate attempts to stem the advance. Kamikaze attacks, surface raids, and defensive battles would exact a toll on American forces, but the fundamental equation had not changed since Pearl Harbor. America's industrial capacity exceeded Japan's by factors of 10 to 20 in every category of production. The Essex-class program was merely the most visible manifestation of that disparity, and Japanese admirals, examining intelligence reports and captured documents, finally understood what Admiral Yamamoto had known from the beginning. They had awakened a giant, and that giant had built an armada that would not stop until Japan surrendered unconditionally. The only question that remained was how many would die before that surrender came. The moment of final clarity came in late October 1944, during the preparation for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japanese naval forces were ordered to sortie against American invasion forces in the Philippines in what amounted to a suicide mission. The plan called for decoy carriers with few aircraft to lure American carriers north, while Japanese battleships attacked the vulnerable landing forces. Vice Admiral Ozawa would command the decoy force. He understood perfectly that his carriers were being sacrificed to enable the battleship attack. His force included 4 carriers. Only Zuikaku remained from the Pearl Harbor strike force, carrying fewer than 30 aircraft total. The other three carriers were even more lightly equipped. Against them would be deployed the full weight of American Task Force 38, with 17 fleet and light carriers and over 1,000 aircraft. Before departing for what he knew would be his final battle, Ozawa met with his staff officers to review the intelligence one final time. They discussed the American order of battle, the confirmed Essex-class carriers in the task force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The overwhelming American advantage in aircraft numbers and quality. One young officer, perhaps seeking reassurance, suggested that Japanese fighting spirit might still yield tactical success. Ozawa's response was recorded by multiple witnesses. "Fighting spirit does not sink carriers," he said. "Bombs and torpedoes sink carriers. The Americans have more of both than we can ever hope to match. We sortie because we have been ordered to do so, not because we have any realistic expectation of victory." The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23 to 26, 1944, resulted in the destruction of Japanese naval power as an organized force. Ozawa's decoy carriers succeeded in their mission, drawing American carriers north. But the cost was absolute. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Japanese battleships and cruisers were destroyed in separate engagements. By October 26, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a combat force capable of contesting American operations. American carriers, including 8 Essex-class ships, emerged virtually unscathed. Their aircraft destroyed Japanese forces with methodical efficiency. The numerical advantage was so overwhelming that American pilots often struggled to find targets among the wreckage of the Japanese fleet. In the aftermath of Leyte Gulf, Japanese naval officers could no longer maintain even the pretense of strategic optimism. The intelligence about American carrier production had been completely accurate. The Essex-class program had delivered exactly what the statistics suggested: an unstoppable armada that could absorb losses, replace damage, and continue operations without pause. Throughout November and December 1944, American carriers ranged freely across the Western Pacific. They struck targets in the Philippines, Formosa, and eventually the Japanese home islands themselves. Japanese defenders watched helplessly as American carrier aircraft appeared in formations that sometimes exceeded 300 planes. Against such numbers, Japanese air defenses proved futile. Japanese naval officers began receiving reports from multiple sources confirming the full scope of American carrier construction. Some information came from interrogation of captured American sailors. More came from neutral country sources, Swedish and Swiss diplomats who traveled between Japan and Allied territories. Japanese intelligence officers in neutral capitals collected information from newspapers and technical journals. By early 1945, Japanese naval intelligence had compiled comprehensive documentation of American carrier production. The final assessment listed each Essex-class, carrier by name, hull number, commissioning date, and operational status. The list read like an execution order: 24 Essex-class fleet carriers either completed or completing, dozens of escort carriers for secondary missions, light carriers filling support roles. Commander Chihaya, working in the intelligence section, later recalled assembling this final assessment. "We created a chart showing American carrier production month by month from 1942 through 1945, he wrote in his post-war memoirs. The line on the graph rose steadily, inexorably. There was no plateau, there was no decline, just continuous, unending production. We posted the chart in the operations room. No one commented on it. What could anyone say? The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers was profound. Many had spent their entire careers preparing for the decisive battle between carrier fleets that would determine Pacific supremacy. They had studied carrier tactics, trained in carrier operations, and believed that skill and spirit could compensate for numerical disadvantage. The Essex-class program demolished those beliefs. American carriers were not just numerous. They were well-designed, well-built, and well-operated. American pilots were thoroughly trained. American doctrine was sophisticated and effective, and American industrial capacity meant that losses could be replaced faster than Japan could inflict them. Some Japanese officers expressed their despair in private writings. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, kept a detailed diary throughout the war. His entry from February 1945 described learning the full extent of American carrier strength. "We are fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity exceeds our own by such magnitude that numerical comparison becomes meaningless," Ugaki wrote. "They build carriers faster than we build destroyers. They replace aircraft losses overnight that would take us months to first replace. Against such force, courage becomes irrelevant." Yet, despite this recognition, Japanese forces continued fighting with desperate intensity. Kamikaze tactics, begun in October 1944, represented the ultimate admission of conventional military defeat. If Japanese forces could not match American strength through traditional means, they would attempt to exploit the psychological impact of suicide attacks. Kamikaze pilots did inflict damage on American carriers. USS Franklin was hit by kamikazes in March 1945 and suffered catastrophic damage, nearly 900 crew members killed. Yet even this severe damage did not sink the ship. Franklin survived and was eventually repaired. The incident demonstrated both the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated carriers and the resilience of American damage control and engineering. For every American carrier damaged by kamikazes, more arrived from American shipyards to take their place. The production pipeline remained full throughout 1945. USS Bonhomme Richard, USS Leyte, USS Kearsarge, USS Oriskany, and others completed their trials and deployed to the Pacific, joining the growing fleet. The technical specifications of the Essex-class carriers revealed why American production capacity translated so effectively into operational dominance. Japanese naval architects who studied captured documents and intelligence reports found themselves confronting design philosophy fundamentally different from their own traditions. The differences extended far beyond simple measurements of length, displacement, or aircraft capacity. They represented divergent approaches to naval warfare itself. Japanese carrier design emphasized craftsmanship and customization. Each carrier was treated as a unique vessel with specific characteristics tailored to particular operational requirements. The Shokaku-class carriers, considered among Japan's finest, featured sophisticated damage control systems and excellent seakeeping qualities. But they also incorporated numerous custom fittings, unique equipment layouts, and specialized components that complicated maintenance and repair. When Shokaku was damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, repairs took nearly 3 months at Kure Naval Arsenal. Skilled workers fabricated replacement parts by hand. Systems had to be individually tested and calibrated. The ship's return to service represented a triumph of Japanese engineering skill, but also demonstrated the limitations of custom construction. Essex-class carriers, by contrast, were designed for standardization and rapid repair. Every ship in the class shared identical layouts, machinery, and systems. Damage control equipment was interchangeable between vessels. Spare parts could be transferred from one carrier to another without modification. When USS Yorktown was damaged at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, emergency repairs were conducted by crew members using standardized procedures and pre-positioned spare components. The carrier remained operational throughout the battle. This standardization extended to every level of the ship's construction. Electrical systems used standardized wiring and connection points. Machinery spaces featured identical layouts, enabling crew transfers between ships without retraining. Even the galleys, berthing spaces, and storage compartments followed standardized designs. The advantage was not merely efficiency, it was resilience. An Essex-class carrier could be repaired at any American naval facility using standard procedures and common parts. Japanese intelligence officers who analyzed these design differences understood their strategic implications. Commander Chihaya later wrote about examining the structural plans. "We admired American engineering but initially dismissed it as lacking elegance," he recalled. Japanese carriers were beautiful ships, each with distinct characteristics. Crude by comparison, mass-produced and utilitarian, only gradually did we realize that what we perceived as crude was actually brilliant. They had sacrificed elegance for effectiveness, and in war, effectiveness is all that matters. The propulsion systems illustrated this philosophy. Japanese carriers typically used specialized boiler and turbine combinations designed for maximum efficiency. These systems achieved excellent speed and range, but required extensive maintenance and skilled operators. Essex-class carriers used standardized machinery derived from existing American naval practice. The engines were reliable, powerful, and most critically, could be maintained by ordinary machinist mates with standard tools and procedures. When Japanese forces examined documents describing American maintenance practices, they were stunned by the simplicity. American carriers conducted routine machinery maintenance using modular replacement techniques. If a pump failed, it was simply removed and replaced with a spare unit. The failed pump was sent to a shore facility for rebuilding. Japanese carriers often required in-place repairs using custom-fabricated parts, work that could take days or weeks, and immobilize the ship. Aircraft handling systems demonstrated similar contrasts. Essex-class carriers featured 3 elevators, 2 on the flight deck and 1 on the side of the hull. This arrangement maximized flight deck space while enabling rapid aircraft movement between the hangar and flight deck. Japanese carriers typically used centerline elevators that interrupted flight deck operations when in use. The American approach enabled faster launch and recovery cycles. Essex-class carriers could launch 30 aircraft in approximately 15 minutes under combat conditions. Japanese carriers required 20 to 30 minutes for similar operations due to elevator positioning and flight deck layout constraints. In carrier warfare, where timing often determined tactical success, these minutes mattered profoundly. But perhaps the most significant technical advantage lay in damage control capabilities. Essex-class carriers incorporated lessons learned from earlier American carriers and from British naval practice. The design featured multiple isolated fire mains, redundant pumping systems, and compartmentalized fuel storage. Each damage control station could function independently even if other sections of the ship were destroyed. The armor protection reflected American priorities. Unlike Japanese carriers, which emphasized speed and aircraft capacity over protection, Essex-class ships carried substantial armor around critical spaces. The machinery spaces, magazines, and aviation fuel storage were protected by armor belts and armored decks. Flight deck structure used thick steel capable of withstanding bomb hits without immediate catastrophic failure. USS Franklin's survival in March 1945 provided dramatic proof of these design advantages. The carrier was struck by 2 bombs that penetrated to the hangar deck where aircraft were being armed and fueled. The resulting explosions and fires killed hundreds and left the ship dead in the water, listing heavily. By conventional expectations, Franklin should have sunk. Instead, damage control parties contained the fires, corrected the list, and eventually restored propulsion. The ship made port under her own power and would eventually be repaired and returned to service. Japanese observers who saw reconnaissance photographs of Franklin's damage could hardly believe the ship survived. Similar damage to a Japanese carrier would almost certainly have resulted in total loss. The contrast with Japanese carrier losses was stark. Taiho, Japan's newest and most sophisticated carrier, was struck by a single torpedo from the American submarine USS Albacore during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The torpedo ruptured aviation fuel lines. Damage control parties failed to properly ventilate the hangar spaces. Fuel vapors accumulated throughout the ship. Hours later, a spark ignited the vapors, causing a massive explosion that destroyed Taiho completely. The carrier sank with heavy loss of life. One torpedo had destroyed Japan's most advanced carrier, while 2 bombs and subsequent catastrophic fires failed to sink an Essex-class ship. Japanese naval officers studying these outcomes understood that American carriers were not just more numerous, they were more survivable, more repairable, and more likely to return to combat after sustaining damage. The aircraft complement of Essex-class carriers represented another overwhelming advantage. Each ship operated a standard air group of approximately 90 aircraft, 36 fighters, primarily F-6F Hellcats by late 1944, 36 dive bombers, SB-2C Helldivers, 18 torpedo bombers, TBM Avengers. This standardized air group enabled coordinated tactics and simplified logistics. Japanese carriers operated smaller and increasingly improvised air groups. By 1944, Japanese carriers rarely embarked more than 50 to 60 aircraft due to pilot shortages and aircraft production limitations. The aircraft themselves, while sometimes competitive in specific performance parameters, increasingly fell behind American designs in overall capability. The F-6F Hellcat fighter, which equipped most Essex-class carriers by late 1943, represented American design pragmatism. It was not the fastest fighter or the most maneuverable, but it was rugged, reliable, easy to maintain, and could be produced in massive quantities. Grumman aircraft built over 12,000 Hellcats during the war. The airplane was designed specifically to defeat Japanese fighters in the hands of average pilots, not aerial acrobats. Japanese naval air forces, by contrast, continued operating variations of the A-6M0 fighter throughout the war. The Zero, brilliant when introduced in 1940, was now outclassed by American fighters. It lacked armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and sufficient engine power to match American designs. Japanese pilots flew Zeros because Japan had no superior replacement in adequate numbers. The disparity extended to pilot training. American carrier pilots received extensive instruction before deployment. Flight training programs emphasized standardized procedures, instrument flying, and tactics. Pilot candidates washed out if they failed to meet standards, but graduates were competently prepared for combat. The training pipeline produced sufficient pilots to fill Essex-class air groups and provide reserves for combat losses. Japan's pilot training programs, resource-constrained and time-pressured, shortened training periods throughout the war. By 1944, Japanese naval pilots often deployed with fewer than 100 hours of flight time. They lacked instrument training, advanced tactical instruction, and gunnery practice. Many were killed in their first combat missions, never having developed the skills necessary for survival. American commanders understood they held overwhelming advantages in aircraft quality, pilot training, and numerical superiority. They designed tactics to exploit these advantages through coordinated strikes, employing hundreds of aircraft. Japanese forces, limited by small air groups and declining pilot quality, could rarely concentrate sufficient strength to overwhelm American defenses. The intelligence reports that reached Japanese naval headquarters throughout late 1944 and early 1945 painted an increasingly hopeless picture. Not only had America built 24 Essex-class carriers, but each carrier operated air groups that exceeded Japan's remaining operational aircraft strength in some categories. The total American carrier air arm numbered several thousand aircraft, all modern types, flown by adequately trained pilots, supported by inexhaustible logistics. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had advocated for kamikaze tactics, justified the desperate strategy explicitly in terms of the numerical disparity. "We cannot match American numbers with conventional tactics," he told subordinates in October 1944. One Japanese pilot in a conventional attack might damage one American ship with luck. One pilot in a kamikaze attack will certainly damage or sink one ship. The mathematics favor suicide. This logic, while brutal, reflected accurate assessment of relative capabilities. Japanese conventional air attacks against American carrier task forces achieved diminishing success throughout 1944. American radar-directed fighter interception, massed anti-aircraft fire, and superior pilot training meant that conventional Japanese strikes suffered prohibitive losses for minimal results. Kamikaze attacks, though horrific, achieved higher hit rates because pilots could aim their aircraft into targets rather than attempting to hit with bombs or torpedoes. Yet even kamikaze tactics could not overcome the fundamental disparity. For every American ship damaged, more arrived to replace it. The Essex-class production pipeline continued, delivering new carriers throughout 1945. USS Antietam, USS Princeton, USS Tarawa, USS Valley Forge, and others completed construction and began working up for combat deployment. By war's end, the United States Navy would operate over 30 fleet carriers of various classes, with over a dozen more under construction. Japanese naval leadership by early 1945 had no illusions about the war's outcome. The intelligence was complete, the assessments were accurate, and the strategic implications were undeniable. America's industrial capacity had produced an armada that Japan could not match, could not defeat, and could barely inconvenience. Every Japanese naval officer with access to classified information understood this reality. Admiral Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, received weekly intelligence summaries detailing American carrier movements and strengths. By March 1945, these summaries documented American carrier strikes against the Japanese home islands themselves. Essex-class carriers operating off the coast of Japan struck airfields, ports, and industrial facilities with impunity. Japanese air defenses, depleted by years of attrition, could mount only token resistance. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers was devastating. Many had entered the war believing in Japanese technological and tactical superiority. They had trained in carrier operations, studied American doctrine, and believed they could prevail through skill and fighting spirit. The Essex-class program demolished these assumptions with mathematical certainty. Some officers expressed their anguish in private correspondence. Captain Toshikazu Ome, a staff officer at Naval General Headquarters, wrote to a colleague in April 1945, describing his feelings upon learning the full scope of American carrier production. "We speak of fighting to the last man, of honorable death over surrender," Ome wrote. "But what honor is there in sending men to die in a war we knew was unwinnable from the beginning? The Americans built their fleet while we watched. They did not hide their strength. We simply refused to believe it." This sentiment, though rarely expressed openly, permeated Japanese naval command by the war's final months. Officers understood they were ordering men into combat not to achieve victory but merely to prolong the inevitable. The decision to continue fighting despite this knowledge would haunt many survivors for the rest of their lives. The strategic bombing campaign and naval blockade tightened throughout early 1945, strangling Japan's ability to sustain military operations. American submarines sank Japanese merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. Raw materials from Southeast Asian territories could not reach Japanese factories. Oil tankers rarely completed the journey from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. The industrial capacity that remained struggled with shortages of steel, aluminum, fuel, and basic materials. Carrier aircraft from Essex-class ships ranged across the Japanese coast, striking with precision and overwhelming force. On July 24 and 28, 1945, American carrier aircraft joined B-29 bombers in massive raids on Kure Naval Arsenal, where Japan's remaining warships were concentrated. The attacks sank or damaged every significant Japanese naval vessel still afloat. The once proud combined fleet was reduced to burning hulks in harbour. Vice Admiral Ozawa, who survived the war, later described watching reconnaissance footage of the Kure raids. "We saw our remaining carriers, battleships, and cruisers destroyed at anchor," he recalled in post-war interviews. "We lacked the fuel to sortie, lacked the aircraft to defend them, and lacked the industrial capacity to repair damage. The Americans flew mission after mission against defenseless targets. It was not warfare. It was industrial execution." The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 provided the final catalyst for surrender, but Japanese naval officers understood that conventional forces had already achieved Japan's strategic defeat. The Essex-class carriers could have continued operations indefinitely, launching thousands of sorties, destroying every Japanese military target, and blockading the home islands into starvation. The atomic bombs merely accelerated the timeline. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, came as relief to many naval officers who understood the war's mathematical inevitability. Captain Ome wrote in his diary that night, "The war we could not win is finally over. The Americans demonstrated power we could not match. They built 24 fleet carriers in the time it took us to complete 2. They replaced losses overnight that would have taken us years to replace. Against such strength, our courage was meaningless. Perhaps now we can rebuild on honest foundations rather than propaganda and delusion." The occupation period and subsequent war crimes trials forced comprehensive accounting of Japan's strategic failures. American occupation authorities conducted extensive interviews with surviving Japanese military leaders. These interrogations produced detailed documentation of how Japanese intelligence assessed American carrier production and what conclusions Japanese commanders drew from those assessments. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted by American analysts after the war, included extensive sections on Japanese naval operations and strategy. Japanese officers provided frank assessments of their own failures. The Essex-class carrier program featured prominently in these discussions as the single clearest example of how American industrial capacity exceeded Japanese comprehension. Vice Admiral Ozawa testified during interrogations that Japanese naval planning had fundamentally misunderstood American production capabilities. "We knew the numbers," Ozawa stated. "Our intelligence provided accurate counts of American shipyards, aircraft factories, and industrial output, but knowing numbers intellectually is different from accepting their strategic implications emotionally. We could not truly believe that one nation could build so much so quickly. By the time we accepted the reality, defeat was certain." Commander Chihaya, working with American occupation authorities to document Japanese naval operations, provided detailed analysis of how intelligence about Essex-class carriers filtered through Japanese command structures. "The information was available from mid-1943 onward," Chihaya explained, "but reporting it accurately conflicted with institutional pressure to maintain morale and justify continued operations. Intelligence officers who emphasized American strength were sometimes accused of defeatism, so reports were cautiously worded, and the full implications were obscured until undeniable." This pattern of institutional denial appeared repeatedly in post-war testimonies. Japanese military culture, emphasizing fighting spirit and loyalty, created incentives to minimize enemy strength and maximize Japanese capabilities. Intelligence officers who accurately reported American production capacity risked censure. Senior commanders who accepted defeatist assessments undermined their own authority. The result was systematic underestimation of American power until tactical defeats made denial impossible. The Essex-class carriers represented not merely numerical superiority, but a fundamental mismatch in industrial capacity and strategic vision. American planners had designed a carrier that could be mass-produced, easily maintained, and rapidly repaired. They had created standardized air groups, training pipelines, and logistical systems that enabled sustained operations across vast distances. They had treated naval aviation not as an art form, but as an industrial system, subject to manufacturing efficiency. Japan, by contrast, had approached carrier warfare as an extension of traditional naval culture. Each carrier was a unique creation. Each pilot was individually trained through lengthy apprenticeship. Each operation was planned with meticulous attention to detail and tactical elegance. This approach had served Japan well in the war's opening campaigns when Japanese forces held qualitative advantages, but it could not scale to match American mass production. The post-war reconstruction of Japan occurred under American occupation and with extensive American aid. Japanese leaders who survived the war observed American industrial methods firsthand during the occupation period. Many drew explicit connections between American manufacturing efficiency and wartime production achievements. The industrial practices that had produced Essex-class carriers at 6-week intervals were the same practices that now produced consumer goods, construction equipment, and rebuilding materials. Japanese engineers and managers studied American methods, adapted them to Japanese circumstances, and eventually created the manufacturing systems that would drive Japan's post-war economic miracle. Ironically, The same industrial efficiency that had defeated Japan militarily would later be adopted by Japanese industry to compete in global markets. The lessons of mass production, standardization, and quality control, learned from studying American wartime production, eventually enabled Japan to become the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s. But for the naval officers who had fought the Pacific War, the memory of Essex-class carriers remained a permanent reminder of industrial reality trumping military tradition. Vice Admiral Ozawa, in his final interviews before his death in 1966, reflected on the moment in November 1944 when he examined the intelligence photographs and realized the full scope of American carrier production. "I understood then that we had lost not just a war but an argument about the nature of modern conflict," Ozawa stated. "We believed that warrior spirit, tactical skill, and cultural superiority could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans proved that in industrial warfare, production capacity determines outcomes more surely than any other factor. They built an armada. We built excuses. The result was inevitable from the moment we attacked Pearl Harbor." Admiral Toyoda, in his post-war memoirs published in 1950, wrote extensively about the psychological impact of American carrier production on Japanese naval planning. Each new intelligence report documenting another Essex-class carrier commissioning felt like a hammer blow, Toyoda recalled. "We would plan operations, assuming certain American strength, then learn that strength had doubled. We would calculate force ratios and realize we could never achieve parity." The most demoralizing aspect was not the numbers themselves, but the implications. If America could build 24 carriers in 3 years, what could they build in 5 years or 10 years? We were not fighting a war. We were fighting an industrial system that could not be defeated by military means. The specific moment when Japanese admirals examined, captured Essex-class documentation, and realized the full scope of American production has become emblematic of the Pacific War's fundamental asymmetry. It represented the collision between traditional military culture and modern industrial warfare, between artisanal craftsmanship and mass production, between hope and mathematics. Japanese naval officers had entered the war believing they could achieve tactical victories sufficient to force negotiated settlement. The Essex-class program demonstrated that tactical victories were irrelevant against an enemy who could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Every Japanese victory was temporary. Every American defeat was recoverable. The industrial base that produced Essex-class carriers ensured that time favored America absolutely. For the young officers who survived the war and lived into the post-war era, the memory of discovering American carrier production capacity became a defining experience. They had witnessed the most comprehensive industrial mobilization in history. They had fought against an enemy whose productive capacity exceeded comprehension. And they had learned, through bitter experience, that industrial power ultimately determines military outcomes in modern warfare. The Essex-class carriers, 24 built in just over 3 years, represented the physical manifestation of that lesson. Each ship was a floating factory of destruction, capable of projecting overwhelming force across thousands of miles of ocean. Together, they formed an armada that Japan could not match, could not counter, and could only delay through sacrifice and desperation. Japanese admirals who examined the intelligence reports, studied the captured documents, and calculated the force ratios understood this with absolute clarity. They knew the war was lost. They knew defeat was inevitable. And they knew that the massive industrial advantage represented by those 24 carriers made any hope of victory a delusion. The mathematics of defeat, written in production statistics and intelligence assessments, told a story that no amount of courage or sacrifice could alter. America had built an armada in 3 years that exceeded Japan's entire naval construction capability over 2 decades. Against such overwhelming industrial power, Japanese resistance became merely a question of time and casualties, not ultimate outcome. That realization, when it finally penetrated the institutional denial and cultural resistance to accepting defeat, marked the moment when Japan's naval leadership understood the war had been lost, not on any battlefield, but in the shipyards and factories where America's industrial might had produced an unstoppable fleet. The Essex-class carriers were not just ships, they were evidence of national power on a scale that transcended military calculation and entered the realm of industrial inevitability. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.